Ancient Egypt, one of the great empires in human history, the creators of the Great Pyramid and the mighty Sphinx. At one time, they were the most powerful country on Earth. But today, if you seek the empire, all you'll find is ruins. What happened to the empire of ancient Egypt? Did they fall prey to conquest, to civil war? Were they undone by climate or plague? Or was the answer something more complicated? To find the end, we have to go back to the beginning. How did Egypt become a powerhouse in the first place? It turns out the answer is climate change. Today, you'll find a desert surrounding Cairo. But in the days when the kingdom of ancient Egypt first began forming, it was a much different place. The area was less dry, covered in trees and grass, and had a lush ecosystem filled with large animals and flocks of birds. That led to the area that's now Egypt becoming a haven for wandering tribes. And around 7,500 years ago, it had become a thriving home of multiple cultures. They were domesticating animals, developing tools and pottery, and starting rudimentary systems of government. And if there's one rule in this world, it's that it's good to be the first. The early years of the region were dominated by the Badarian people, who were the first tribe known to have settled there. They were soon followed by the Naqada, which forged weapons from imported obsidian and built the region from a few small farms into a large city. And it was about location, location, location. The Naqada were now in control of the Nile Valley, and most of the trade in the region went through them. They quickly established relations with both Nubia and Mesopotamia, traded their crafts all around the region, and even developed the first rudimentary system of written symbols that would eventually evolve into hieroglyphics. And this civilization was about to take its first big leap into empire. But first, are you ready to take your own big leap into forming an empire? Because you can with the sponsor of today's video, Rise of Kingdoms, the free cross-platform strategy game with over 100 million players worldwide. In Rise of Kingdoms, you get to choose a real civilization from history, recruit hundreds of real-life historical generals, train special soldiers from each civilization, collect resources, and develop technology as you break through to the next era of history and build your ultimate dream city. There's never been a better time to try the Rise of Kingdoms, since now you can play as the mysterious, majestic kingdom of Egypt, build pyramids, grotto tombs, sun temples, and even Greco-Roman styles in the original Egyptian architectural style. Bring powerful troops and historical heroes to the battlefield like the great war hero Thutmose III, the great priest Imhotep, Ramses II, and even Cleopatra, as you compete with 12 other civilizations to make sure that this time, the once great civilization doesn't disappear from the map. So what are you waiting for? And there's never been a better time to try Rise of Kingdoms, since it's now available both on mobile and PC. Click the link in the description to download the game now, and use the gift code to get bonus resources. By participating in in-game community events, new and current players will have the chance to win a round-trip ticket to Egypt. But back to the real Egypt. How does a dynasty begin? With a king, of course. Much of early Egyptian history is vague, since few people were writing it down. But the famous Egyptian priest and scholar Manetho claimed that the official history began with a king named Menes. At the time, Egypt was split into two kingdoms, and the king slowly unified them into one. However, many historians believe that Menes might be an amalgamation of different kings or a myth designed to create a unifying figure. The transition to a unified Egypt may have happened more slowly, but what is known is that around 3150 BCE, the early dynastic period was beginning, and it would soon grow beyond their wildest dreams. The early kings were based in Lower Egypt, with the capital in Memphis. A combination of labor and a rich agricultural sector allowed the kings to grow their wealth rapidly, and they spent it on one thing that made sense, of course: massive tombs celebrating the man who made it all possible. Every successive king built elaborate structures for themselves, and this was the era where the king started to be worshipped as a god. While these mastaba tombs weren't the same as the eventual pyramids, it's easy to see the influence on what would become Egypt's greatest architectural achievement. And after only 500 years, Egypt and the world looked completely different. The age of the Old Kingdom is believed to have begun around 2686 BCE, and this is where the ancient Egypt that most people know took shape. The kingdom was booming, as their vast agricultural sector could sustain a larger population, and new arrivals were coming from all around Africa and Asia. A strong system of government was forming, with administrators collecting taxes and using the money to create infrastructure, including irrigation systems that made the crops bear more vegetables. If you were the ruling class at this point, life was good. Although if you were a peasant, maybe less so. It was common for the working class to be drafted by the rulers to work on whatever construction project was deemed most important at the moment. And this was where the king's power reached their apex. It's called spectacle creep, and we see it in the movies. The last installment in the series had the heroes fight a T-Rex. Well, in this installment they have to fight 3 cyborg T-Rexes. There were no cyborg T-Rexes in Egypt, but every king felt the pressure to top his successor. Both meant continuing the path of endless growth for the empire and creating even more impressive monuments. This period was where Egypt created the monuments that still stand today, the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx, both of which tower over the modern cities today and bring people from around the world. But the first crack in the armor of ancient Egypt was about to emerge. The kings were devoting a lot of resources to celebrating themselves, but the kingdom's vast resources made sure no one noticed, until the resources weren't there. The extensive land grants to temples celebrating past kings were starting to take their toll on the kingdom's economy. The king started to face opposition from local governors, and the country became decentralized. But as long as the economy remained stable, the king could hold on to power. But the good times couldn't last forever. Around 2200 BCE, the kingdom was hit with severe droughts, devastating the agricultural sector and taking the country with it. The central government collapsed and those seeking power celebrated. But their celebration was not going to last. The first intermediate period of ancient Egypt lasted around 125 years, but it would feel a lot longer. While many ambitious governors hoped an Egypt without a central government would lead to opportunities for them, they were soon hit hard with the truth. With no central government, there was no one to give them money to maintain their areas. This led to massive food shortages, which led to a civil war. Those local leaders who had no plan often saw their rules end quickly and brutally, but those who knew how to adapt saw their provinces flourish and the local economy excel. And with no king, those local governors often saw themselves become kings of their own little world and spread out seeking more. So what would a divided Egypt look like? During this century-long period, Egypt was dominated by 2 kingdoms, the Kingdom of Thebes in the south and the Kingdom of Heracleopolis to the north. But as time went on, the forces in Thebes, led by the Intef family, grew stronger, and in 2055, King Mentuhotep II led the Theban forces deep into Heracleopolitan territory and accomplished what had only happened once before: the unification of Egypt. A new era was about to begin, the Middle Kingdom. But fractures in Egypt's structure had been revealed, and the question was whether the new rulers would learn from the past. Magic 8 Ball says, outlook cloudy. At first, it seemed like the good times were here again. The new rulers of Egypt, starting with Mentuhotep II, went back to expanding the kingdom and created a boom in art, literature, and building of monuments. To the outsider, Egypt looked like it was stronger than ever before, and in many ways it was. The new dynasty wanted Egypt to be less vulnerable to natural disaster than before, and in addition to expanding the country's agricultural efforts, they conquered areas of the Kingdom of Nubia and took over the quarries and gold mines. They were also clearly worried about being vulnerable to conquest, so they developed one of the first large-scale security projects in the history of the world, a massive fortification known as the Walls of the Ruler that guarded the eastern front of Egypt. It would lead to some significant shifts in the culture as well. While early Egyptian art was more focused on celebrating the ruler, now things were developing a little subtlety. Much of the art and literature during the era had an introspective edge, and the gods the Egyptians worshipped were given more complexity. Osiris became the most significant deity during this era, and this god of fertility had many statues and monuments made of him. Construction projects were ramping up, and Egypt had much need for labor, so they brought in many foreign workers to toil on these projects and ramped up building and mining. This would prove to be the Middle Kingdom's undoing. The second golden era for Egypt was undone by drought and famine. This time the enemy would be too much of a good thing. Massive Nile floods hit the region, causing extensive damage to the under-construction infrastructure and straining the economy. The ruler at the time, Amenemhat III, was unprepared, and the large number of Canaanite settlers he allowed in as workers suddenly posed a threat as people scrambled to survive. This group, known as the Hyksos, soon took power in the Nile Delta, and the process of carving up of Egypt soon would begin. The ancient Egyptians had built a stunning achievement, but it would never get this good again. I know what you're thinking, but there's so much of Egyptian history to come. What about all those famous rulers of Egypt who haven't even reigned yet? Here's the big twist. They ruled all right, but that doesn't mean that they were Egyptians. Because from here on out, the empire of ancient Egypt becomes less of a stable country and more of the world's biggest game of keep-away. They built something amazing, but the question now becomes if they're strong enough to keep it, and who will reap the benefits when the original rulers fall. And the first rulers were already there. The Hyksos, who were one of the largest group of foreigners in Egypt, quickly took advantage of the chaos and established their own power base in the delta. They spread out from there, and it was around 7 1785 BCE when they made their move on the current capital of Egypt in Avaris. The king, who had lost much of his power base, was forced to flee back to Thebes. Maybe it was the way the Hyksos were invited in, but they didn't seem interested in deposing the rulers, instead treating the king as a subordinate. As long as he paid them tribute, he was free to continue to rule, but anyone who visited Egypt at the time might have been fooled into thinking the Egyptians were still in charge, because the Hyksos seemed to like patterning their society after them. While they kept many of the cultural trappings of the era, they did make big leaps in one area, and that all comes back to war. The Egyptians had a powerful army, but it was high on manpower and low on modern weaponry. The Hyksos quickly changed that, bringing in new tools like the composite bow for fast firing and horse-drawn chariots for fast riding. Soon, enemies would be facing much more dangerous Egyptian army, and just in time, because they were ready to make a move. The central government in Thebes had been quietly building its strength and was ready to try and take control of its territory again. A brutal civil war lasted 30 years. At the same time, the Nubian Empire to the south was ready to make a move into Egypt and take over Thebes. Ultimately, the war ended in a stalemate as Thebes fended off Nubia but failed to defeat the Hyksos, and the once mighty empire now stood divided for another generation. But everything old is new again. The Theban forces had a new king, Ahmose I, and he made the rebuilding of Egypt's military a big priority. Through a hard-fought campaign, he drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and reclaimed the lost territory. But he wasn't done yet. He wanted to take control of the Near East and take as much of the territory that surrounded Egypt. So began the age of the New Kingdom, which would last around 500 years and be ancient Egypt's last hurrah. This new Egypt not only built itself the largest empire the country had ever seen, but its kings took on a new title, Pharaoh. This was also the era of one of Egypt's most famous rulers, the Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as a pharaoh and repaired much of the damage done by the Hyksos. She led many of the trading expeditions, leading to Egypt gaining large quantities of imports, such as bronze and wood. With these new resources, massive temples would be built, and she would go down as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. With new territory and more resources, it seemed like the new kingdom might go down as the beginning of something enduring for Egypt. But all it takes is one bad apple to screw up the whole barrel. Why did the new kingdom eventually decline? It's a complicated issue, but the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten certainly didn't help. A notoriously eccentric and ruthless ruler, he abandoned Egypt's traditional polytheistic faith and instead announced the obscure sun god Aten would instead be worshipped as the one true god. Followers of the other gods were persecuted, massive projects dedicated to extolling Aten were started, and he even ordered the capital city moved to a new location, one which he named after himself, of course. His legacy only lasted as long as his life, and his successor, the famous boy king Tutankhamun, quickly started undoing many of his edicts and restored the traditional system of worship. Could a country recover from the reign of a mad king? It could when they had a great one right around the corner. Around 1279 BCE, Ramses II took the throne, believed by many to be the pharaoh of the biblical Exodus. What is known is that this ambitious ruler was responsible for a massive increase in statues and obelisks, as he put the country's massive resources to work. He also began conquests in the neighboring areas, waging an extensive battle against the Hittites that led to the first peace treaty in recorded history. To anyone living under Egypt under Ramses II, life was good. No wonder they built so many statues of this guy. But Egypt may have ultimately been a victim of its success. Egypt was now the richest country in the world, and it was surrounded by people who wanted a piece of that. The Libyan Berbers to the west were watching enviously from their much poorer country. In Egypt's territory in Canaan, they were dealing with the growing Assyrian Empire on their borders. In the Aegean Sea, a loose group of seafaring pirates began waging attacks on the border. The Egyptian army was strong enough to fend these invaders off at first, but another danger was brewing. Within the vast infrastructure Ramses II had created, the high priests had much power, and they often used this to enrich themselves, essentially becoming local governors. This was what accelerated the collapse of the country during the previous era, and history was repeating itself. But this time the consequences would be more dire. Two empires on their borders and a marauding band of pirates in their territorial waters meant the Egyptians would be fighting a war on multiple fronts indefinitely, and it took its toll. Egypt lost much of its territory in the Near East, and around 1069 the Third Intermediate Period began. This was when Egypt's empire largely started falling apart, without and within. The high priests of Thebes took more autonomy over their city, Libyan forces took control of the south of the country, and power struggles continued to undermine the country. 300 years into this period, an invasion from Kushite territory seized Thebes and the Delta, and King Piye began to establish his own empire. Egypt would remain, but would it really be Egypt anymore? You might be surprised. The Kushite rule of Egypt took on many of the attributes of the original rulers, and many of the defining traits of the empire are actually from this period, namely the pyramids. While the Great Pyramid was built thousands of years earlier, the Kushites were the one who built the majority of Egypt's pyramids. But despite this, Egypt's influence in the world was waning greatly. Most of the territories had been claimed by other empires, and their allies were quickly becoming conquered by the Assyrians. And it wouldn't be long before the Assyrians set their eyes on Egypt, invading in the early 600s BCE and driving out the Kushites. But this wouldn't be like other conquests. The Assyrians had their own culture and no interest in adopting the Egyptian one. They promptly sacked the famous temples of Thebes, took control of the kingdom and turned it over to their vassals rather than administer it directly. This left them open to betrayal, and only a few decades later the regional king cut a deal with Greek mercenaries and drove the Egyptians out of Egypt. The Greeks gained influence in Egypt, celebrated their victory, and then were promptly invaded by the powerful Persian Empire in 525. While the Persian ruler called himself Pharaoh of Egypt, he didn't even base his rule there, instead administering it from Iran and putting down rebellions. This was the official end of the Egyptian Empire, and it was annexed by the Persians. But it was far from the end of Egypt. Egypt was still a wealthy region with no shortage of treasures, and just about every empire in the world wanted a piece of it. The reign of the Persians lasted several hundred years, but in 332 BCE, a new top dog in the world had emerged. He ruled the Ptolemaic kingdom, and he had come to be known as Alexander the Great. At the time, Egypt was ruled by Persian agents, and the public resented their treatment. So when Alexander and his army came rolling in, they were greeted as deliverers. Unlike the Assyrians and the Persians, Alexander the Great had a deep admiration for the culture of ancient Egypt and restored many of its cultural elements. Basing his capital in the port city of Alexandria, he turned it into a thriving city of trade and learning, and his successors built the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, making Egypt the only country to have two of the seven wonders of the world. It was Egypt's greatest era as a colony, with Hellenistic culture and Egyptian culture living side by side. But all good things must come to an end. Alexander the Great was a one-of-a-kind leader, and his successors struggled to maintain peace and keep the public happy. This led to an internal strife, attempts by ambitious rulers to reform the Egyptian religion, and localized rebellions. But one area was booming: trade. In fact, Egyptians were sending more of their grain abroad than ever before now that they had a powerful neighbor, the Roman Empire, the fast-growing continent-spanning kingdom based out of Italy. Rome was increasingly dependent on Egyptian exports, and some scheming rulers started thinking, wouldn't it just be easier if we owned Egypt instead of buying things from them? But wait, what happened to the most famous Egyptian ruler of all? If you ask people for one Egyptian ruler, odds are they'll name Cleopatra, the powerful queen best known for starring in her own Shakespeare play and being famously played by Elizabeth Taylor and soon Gal Gadot. But what most people don't know is that she wasn't Egyptian at all. She was the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty and famously fell in love with Roman politician Mark Antony. They attempted to defend Egypt against the Roman invasion, but their forces were defeated, and Octavian, the man who would become the first Roman emperor, took control of the massive territory. And with that, most people believed that the newly named Emperor Augustus became the richest man in the world. Obtaining what was once the richest country in the world would do that. And so the Egyptian empire ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Romans ruled the Egyptians with a firmer hand than any other empire, administering it directly and eliminating many of their traditions. As Christianity took root in Rome, it would soon establish itself in Egypt as well, with the Egyptian Orthodox Church becoming one of the earliest denominations of Christianity to still be around. The Romans were the strongest empire in the world at the time, some would argue ever, and no other power challenged their reign. Resistance against Roman rule was limited within Egypt as they were too busy fighting amongst themselves. The battle between Christianity and the local faith continued for several hundred years, until 391 CE, when Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of Egypt and shuttered the temples. Slowly, the traditions of ancient Egypt faded into history, and hieroglyphics became a lost language for a long time. But no empire lasts forever. The Roman Empire slipped into decline by the 4th century CE, and Egypt found itself as part of the Eastern Empire based in Constantinople. As empires battled for the scraps left by Rome, Egypt would find itself under Persian control once again, and the Byzantine Empire would retake it in the 600s. Finally, in 639, the Muslim Rashidun army would invade and throw out the Byzantine army, establishing the Muslim Arab rule of the country that largely continues to this day. Egypt endures, and so do many of its greatest cultural artifacts, but the Egypt that exists today is only roughly 20 empires removed from the one that defined it. which raises the question, why did Egypt ultimately fall? It's hard to pinpoint one point of failure, especially since Egypt is one of the first empires to grace the earth. But ancient Egypt did not die out due to the climate or internal strife or rival nations, it died out due to all of them. The kingdom didn't fall once, it fell again and again and again, sometimes to invasion, sometimes to other factors. But its internal structure was strong enough that when the opportunity presented itself, it would rebuild fairly quickly and take back control. Its two later Great Kingdom periods both came after intermediate periods of collapse, and it came back from each period stronger. So why didn't that repeat itself another time? The most likely explanation is that after the third intermediate period, what was left just wasn't strong enough to maintain any consistent resistance. The constant ebb and flow of various empires and their differing approaches to governing the Egyptian people likely kept any powerful rebellion from emerging. And by the time Rome came into the picture, it had been hundreds of years since Egypt had been an independent nation. Then came the long period of Roman oppression, where most of what Egypt stood for was systematically wiped out. By the time that it ended, the remnants of ancient Egypt were nothing but ruins, and the sense of a national identity was weaker than ever. So, what about Egypt today? Egypt was a province of the British Empire until 1922. It had previously been ruled by the Ottomans, but has maintained independence for 100 years now. Still, largely populated by Arab Muslim populations that took over in a previous conquest in the post-Rome era, their 100 years of liberation has been chaotic. They've been involved in several wars and have been ruled by kings, socialist leaders, elected leaders, and currently a military dictator. But despite this, they're considered one of the most stable countries in the Middle East and have a strong diplomatic relationship with most of their neighbors. As for their history, they still hold their time as top empire of Africa with great pride, and many of the remaining sites are among the world's greatest tourist sites. But ancient Egypt's greatest legacy might be outside of the country. There are a few ancient empires that capture the world's fascination more than Egypt, with trappings like the pyramids, the Sphinx, the story of Exodus, and of course the mummies who are probably not getting back out of their sarcophaguses once they were entombed in real life. No empire lasts forever. If the ancient Egyptians are still featuring in Hollywood movies thousands of years later, it's pretty safe to say the Romans weren't as successful as they'd hoped. Want to learn more about ancient Egypt? Watch Evidence Reveals How the Pyramids Were Actually Built, or check out Horrifying Secrets from Egyptian Book of the Dead for some darker tales.